Good morning, everyone. Really happy to have you all here. Today, I would like to talk to you about future-proofing growth, more specifically focusing on some of the challenges and the opportunities that the recent privacy changes are bringing to us. Before jumping into that, just very, very briefly introducing myself, have been in the industry for a little over a decade. Some of the more notable games and apps I had the fortune to work with, and of course, as it was mentioned recently, essentially for the last 2.5, 3 years focusing on the Subway Surfers portfolio and trying to essentially oversee growth. Originally, my home ground is in performance marketing, in paid acquisitions, and then slowly but surely had the chance and the privilege to learn the broader spectrum of growth, including platform relations, a little bit of product marketing, and so on. Should you like to connect, more than happy to kind of connect with all of you here. In terms of SYBO, I believe you probably have heard about us. We have a small game called Subway Surfers. Chances are that if you have a mobile phone and ever played the game, probably we have a 50% chance of you playing. We were fortunate enough to cross the 4 billion downloads last year, and eventually kind of having like a whole brand and the reach around our games. Of course, our main home ground is Subway Surfers, but we have a couple of additional titles that are focusing on more puzzle genres, smaller niches, and we also have a new game in soft launch that we are quite excited for coming early next year on that side. Without further ado, let's briefly jump into kind of like the key points. Around the future proofing, I would like to walk you through 3 key fundamental building blocks. The first one would be a little bit just to kind of understand and introduce the foundations. I believe most of you have already been exposed to these topics, so I'm not really kind of saying that there will be something groundbreaking new, but maybe helping to a little bit understand and structure things better. The second part will be mostly focusing on the challenges these changes have brought, both from a regulation perspective as well as from the perspective of the platforms, from the public scrutiny that we can see. And then last but not least, okay, how can we navigate around this? What would be kind of like the steps, how we can future-proof ourselves to make sure that we essentially succeed in the long term? So starting out with the fundamentals, starting with a couple of very basic terminologies. I apologize for this. I thought it would be good to have a common vocabulary, so whenever I'm referring to a specific term that you understand what I actually mean. So of course, privacy is a fundamental human right. I believe that's something that we don't really need to debate much about. Everybody kind of prefers to have a degree of privacy in their life, making sure that again, things can be assessed. From a marketing and growth perspective, I believe there are 3 key questions that we need to understand and operate with. The first one is, of course, what is essentially personal and private data? The second part, of course, is how is that data processed? What could be the typical transactions? And then, last but not least, what are the concrete user rights stipulated in different laws, regulations that actually explicitly required us from our side to be compliant with? So let's walk through these 3 questions. First, around the data. So again, personal data, or so-called the legal term personally identifiable information, PII, essentially refers to all the different identifiers, data points of a person that helps to uniquely identify that person. Of course, it could be something as sensitive and as critically important like a social security number, to a phone number, to an email. And of course, when we look at the broader spectrum of growth, we would be then getting into the different advertising identifiers, device identifiers, that though on its own does not necessarily pinpoint out a specific individual, but granted the close connection that again, most of us have our phones in our pockets, chances are that again, the device kind of identifies the person. As a second building block, what kind of processing steps we can think about? Here there are 3 key building blocks and steps. First, how is the data captured? So essentially, what are the different tools and technologies? Is it something where people have awareness of it? Is it something that is automated, so to say, happening behind the curtain? The second point, of course, how is the data transferred? And there are especially certain peculiarities when we talk about a global economy where data is kind of like passed among multiple different channels and multiple different places. And last but not least, of course, how the data is stored on that side. When it gets to the specific user rights, so if we delve into the capturing, so again, first and foremost, the knowledge. So in most cases, as we know, people need to have a prior understanding what kind of data and information is collected about them, and essentially what is the intended use of that data. And in most cases, of course, we also need to provide them the chance to make a choice. Do we really want to opt in to sharing this information, or is it something where essentially we are more just assuming that everybody's fine, and rather an opt-out model when people can explicitly say that, okay, I do not wish to be tracked. In terms of transferring the information, again, it is quite straightforward, I believe. We need to safeguard the information transfer. Of course, this can be done through different secure technologies, API connection, whatnots, but the key critical point, of course, that not like in the back old good days when, for instance, I started in the whole mobile gaming space, where we were sending user lists back and forth in an email as a CSV file. Those days are, of course, gone. So essentially safeguarding that data transfer is critical and crucial. Last but not least, the storage has two key right pillars that are usually stipulated in the different legislation and laws. The first one evolves around, of course, the retention. So how long are we able to kind of maintain and keep that data? And then the second part, the visibility. So that means that the individual user's rights to request essentially what kind of information different advertising partners, vendors, service providers hold on them. I believe the old paradigm has been that, okay, we are just trying to collect all the information that we can, try to have it as granular as possible, and essentially we'll see what we'll make out of it over time. Currently, again, due to the different pressure points coming from regulators, coming from platforms, this is becoming more a need-to-know basis. And essentially, we are trying to focus on information and data points that are justified to make sure that, again, we minimize the unnecessary data and potentially, again, safeguard against data leaks, breaches. As we always know, unfortunately, that will never cease. Stepping ahead from here, I would now like to a little bit review the key laws. So essentially, the key pieces of legislation that shaped. Little caveat here, coming from a gaming background, this is heavily focused on the gaming space. So I can highlight that, of course, there will be a couple of additional legislation points that are related towards privacy, messaging, marketing on that side. Having said that, I believe these fundamental laws are, I think, quite important. And in case there are maybe some non-gaming advertisers in the room, of course, there are a couple of additional considerations just to be kept in mind. So in terms of the landmark legislations, just kind of walking through them. So essentially the COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act from the United States, the Privacy Directive from the EU, and then, of course, the more recent GDPR. And then the UK Children's Code apparently seems to be quite a dominant piece of legislation that is making its way to European legislation, to other ones. Definitely at SYBO, we are paying quite a close attention, especially since Brexit happened. Of course, compliance within the whole European market now also means having some specialties that is coming from the United Kingdom specifically. And of course, the question is, how does this impact growth overall? So first and foremost, the consent requirements. I think we discussed this very, very briefly beforehand, being, again, one of the fundamental rights that people need to understand and then have the choice to consent. Most cases, of course, this refers to a prior consent. So it's not just something, again, that a consent that is automatically granted, and then users, if they decide to, can withdraw from it. They need to understand, of course, the usage purpose, what would be kind of like the idea. And then last but not least, of course, as we all know, an additional step in the onboarding funnel usually means an additional potential point of friction. The second point, of course, is the record keeping part. So we need to make sure, again, that we're only collecting the justified data, as we discussed before, as opposed to the old paradigm where we are trying to collect and maximize the information available at our hands, and making sure that, again, we're also able to disclose should the request come across from that perspective. Last but not least, of course, the right to opt out. So again, if we're talking about a prior consent, that already happens at the very early stage of the funnel. Having said that, the user has to have the right, and we as game developers need to have the enforcement mechanisms to allow people to essentially opt out at any stage of their journey on that side. So again, this from a more growth perspective means, of course, we will have more limited data. This means, again, that we need to make sure that we have a little bit of compliance overheads, things that we need to essentially, so to say, tick box. Should there be kind of like an inquiry into our companies, into our operations, we would then be able to step ahead from there. Little bit about the history following from here. So, of course, as mentioned, back in the good old days, the first time we literally were working with device IDs, hardware IDs. I remember definitely the first time I was working in mobile gaming, we were literally passing around MAC addresses. So people who might not be familiar, the MAC address, for the simplification of the term, it's literally the hardware identifier of the antenna of your phone. And that was kind of the ID that we were passing back and forth in the good old-fashioned CSV formats, which wasn't exactly the safest way possible. Then, of course, there was a level of scrutiny and kind of like saying, okay, that's kind of highly sensitive, private. Then came the age of the advertising identifiers. I believe most of us know about them. Let it be the Apple IDFA, let it be the Google AID. And essentially, these were identifiers that were built specifically for advertising purposes. So what this means that you could actually reset them, you could anonymize them, you essentially had the chance to opt out. So kind of some of the basic fundamental privacy protection mechanisms were built into these systems. Having said that, as we have seen over time, kind of granted the evolution of both the technology as well as a little bit kind of like the industry's focus on more deeper and extended data models, machine learning, AI eventually, we got to a stage again where this became like a very automated profiling system. And this was yet again another point where both public scrutiny as well as the regulatory insights came in and said, okay, time out, there needs to be something done because now people are being fairly comprehensive profiles across different devices, across different applications. And that's where more or less we are heading to the privacy-centric approach, or sometimes called as the ID-less. I believe we all been there where kind of like the ground shook and the SKAd network went live with the first Apple rollout with iOS 14. And then eventually, as the individual systems are catching up, Android Privacy Sandbox, will be talking about this in a moment, is still somewhere on the way. Seems to be a bit more pacific approach than what Apple did back in the days. But of course, that's still to be seen what will be the whole ecosystem-wide impact on that. But again, the idea is that ultimately we are trying to step away from kind of using any user-level identifiers and rather trying to use some sort of a more group or segment-level systems to kind of like understand still the key information, provide the necessary data points for optimization, but at the same time essentially safeguard the individual user's privacy. So let's have a deeper look at the two platforms. So on the iOS side, again, this is just a very quick recap. I believe most of us are familiar with the SKAd network. So again, starting out with, of course, the information disclosure. So as we know now, on the App Store pages, we always need to disclose what kind of information is collected, what would be the intended purposes of that. As a second building block, of course, the ATT consent prompt, which as said, has become essentially a little bit of a conversion bottleneck for most of us. And then last but not least, of course, the whole attribution system that Apple said, okay, now we're going to do the attribution for you on that part. And of course, here is just a small summary from Adjust on that side, but I guess you can pretty much read on everything. You are probably familiar. So starting with kind of like the limited information that you're receiving, the level of granularity that is now missing, the randomized timers. As the system evolves, of course, it gets better and better, as we've seen with SKAd and for 4.0, 5.0, now opening up to retargeting, opening up to additional quality signals, let it be coarse signals or more fine-grained ones. And again, still there is an opportunity for users who actually opt in to essentially share the full and fully transparent information. Should you be interested, I suggest again definitely checking out the Adjust, or for that matter, any kind of partners kind of like documentation that they usually have a fairly comprehensive overview. On the Android platform, we are talking about the Android Privacy Sandbox. This is a system that has, I believe, been announced about good 2 years ago, and it was originally intended to be full in production by now. Currently, it is in a delayed state as far as we know. What we know so far, outside of course the technical documentation, is that Google was shopping around quite rigorously for beta testers in a sense. So they have kind of tried to contact many companies to kind of trying to participate and help them curate the new system. The system will be broken out into two main pieces. The one is considered to be the privacy preserving APIs. Without getting into fine-grained details, it will essentially a little bit mimic what you can get from the SKAd network. So there will be, of course, certain attribution reporting pieces. There will be, of course, certain interest or topics, as they are calling, and again, trying to have additional analytics, specifically trying to cater to retargeting and re-engagement. On the second side, they're building essentially a system that little bit, encapsulates the SDKs and the tracking system, what they call the SDK runtime. So essentially having a privacy additional layer, that means that the code of the tracking systems will be running in a little bit more contained environment as opposed to kind of like the plain source code. As mentioned, the current status is that it was intended to be a 2-year rollout, completing at the end of this year. It has not yet happened. When I was kind of trying to ask around with a couple of industry friends and peers, I know here and there a couple of people kind of participating in some very private betas, but overall it is still very much in the making. What we do know, which could be a bit of a ray of light and hope, that Google at this very moment does not intend to sunset the Android Google Play App Install Referrer, and granted the presence of the App Install Referrer, of course, the deterministic attribution in a relatively good level should still be available. Having said that, of course, going forward when the actual system gets rolled out and what will be the end shape of it, we are yet to see. And again, yet the technical documentation from the Google side, should you be interested in that. So having had this initial introduction to kind of like the foundations, the basic understanding, the public scrutiny, the different laws, the individual platform specifications, I would now like to delve a little bit deeper into kind of what could be the potential challenges. I believe many of us on a daily basis have faced this at one point or another on that side. So like I said, again, nothing groundbreaking new as far as I'm concerned, but they're trying to kind of triangulate them into a specific format. So first and foremost, before we dive into the individual building blocks, I would like to talk about kind of like the balance between the two sides. So of course, on one side, we have privacy, where we are trying to essentially establish privacy for the users, making sure that again the data is respected, that we are compliant, that only the necessary information, that people are informed and aware what's happening to them and their data. On the other side, of course, we have growth, paid acquisitions, marketing, mobile marketing in general, where we would prefer to have granular insights, better optimizations. We would prefer to essentially have fine-grained trained algorithms to kind of help us drive. So naturally, the ultimate question is, how can these two worlds coexist? What would be kind of like the way of kind of dealing with this? Well, I guess this is where we would get into the space of privacy-conscious advertising, for the lack of the better term. So on one part, of course, we do need to intend to maintain our human touch. We need to make sure to be respectful and mindful of the privacy perspectives. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that we're operating businesses. We need to have the necessary amount of data and information to do our jobs the best we can, to optimize for the returns that should hopefully be yielding us essentially a success in the long term. And last but not least, something that I see a little bit time to time gets overlooked is, I think, the part of the consumer education. So I do believe that, again, privacy-conscious marketing is not just us marketers trying to bend to fit the laws, to be compliant, to essentially do that, but we also have an active role in a little bit trying to disclose and get the general public to understand what are the potential benefits and upsides. Ultimately, if we step very, very back to the foundations, so again, mobile gaming, free-to-play gaming in special, again, the foundational business model is that, again, you do not need to pay for a gaming experience, but in exchange, you consent to sharing certain information. So number one, we can optimize your gaming experience better to make sure that you enjoy the most the time that you spend inside those games and your applications. And then number two, that you actually provide us the opportunity to make a living so that we can continue providing this service. And I feel sometimes, of course, we have the different horror stories that make the different headlines in the newspapers or in the news. But sometimes I think this other side of the coin is not really kind of disclosed. And that's what I would also put forward. And that's something occasionally at SYBO we also try to do a little bit, provide a piece of public education to kind of help people understand that no, we are not spying on you because we want to kind of do this and that. We are trying to operate a business. We are trying to operate and offer you a better service that hopefully in turn will essentially give you a better gaming experience and us the opportunity to continue providing you that experience. So let's dive into the practical implications. This will be, of course, a very oversimplified initial view, kind of looking at things, but as always, step by step, I will try to kind of dig deeper and deeper into the different building blocks. So of course, the challenges of privacy from the very strict growth performance marketer mindset. I think the first one is quite straightforward. So I think where most of us heard the most is the data efficiency and the data points. So again, understanding the level of accuracy, the level of precision and kind of granularity of information that we had before, that's unfortunately gone. The second building block, of course, is the general user acquisition activities on that side. So that let it be creative level reporting, let it be kind of the limitations evolving around certain campaign limitations that we need to essentially respect because that we, for instance, don't have just 100 slots on the SKAd network system. And last but not least, especially for games like SYBO's case, where we are ad monetized, of course, the less information we have, the worst CPMs that we are foreseeing. So essentially, it puts a very strong downward pressure on the revenue generation and the ad monetization opportunities from our perspective. I would now like to dive one step a little bit deeper into each of these key areas. So what would be essentially these known issues? So starting out with the first one, again, in the user acquisition side, I think we are aware that, again, the campaign limitations, the transparency of the data, the lack of creative insights in certain cases. Again, this provides an opportunity for innovation, and we are trying to model certain things out or use opted-in data or use information points that we might have from historical reference points to kind of get to a better stage. But ultimately, we are essentially operating at a little bit more shaken ground. The second building block, of course, is the creative optimization. I believe most of us know that one of the biggest challenges of a UA manager is finding out how they can optimize the funnel. Let it be from the early impression to a single click through creative optimization and design, or let it be the App Store optimization. And again, through different steps, we are actually able to dive deeper and deeper into these topics, and we are essentially able to use custom product pages, A/B testing whatsoever, incrementality studies eventually. But ultimately, again, the creative optimization has definitely taken a hit. Now, many of the companies, including ourselves, at High, we essentially decided to shift still towards Android, where we still have full deterministic model, and we are actually able to get the creative learnings at a relatively accurate level. Having said that, we do know that there are still nuanced differences between the platforms. So if we really want to fine-tune and essentially get the best possible performance, for the iOS users, for instance, then we do need to do a certain extent of testing around that. In terms of the next building block, a little bit about audience management. So as mentioned, as we do know, yet again, for instance, from the SKAd network, that if a segment doesn't even have a certain frequency of users, then the segment information will, for instance, completely be dropped and removed. So that's usually what we call the privacy thresholds in the system. Again, this provides, on one hand, an opportunity to a little bit rethink and restructure maybe some of the previous campaigns. Again, I remember back in the good old days, on an average day, you would run somewhere between 200 to 400 different campaigns, all the different segments, markets, combinations, creative, messaging, whatever you can think about. Currently, we tend to more aggregate it and trying to focus on larger, broader segments and trying to essentially give way towards more machine learning and essentially additional automated learning systems to optimize for the better performance. Here, also an important call out, of course, with the audience management, that the first-party data is becoming ever more important. Ultimately, if we have first-party data that we are able to leverage on our in-house systems, that's something that helps us maybe to fine-grain. Where, of course, the limitation of first-party data comes to a great deal of extent in order to pass it out towards third parties to essentially be able to provide it to, let's say, an optimization or something. In an ideal scenario, user consent would be needed. I do know that this is something that is at times quite heavily debated between the marketing and the legal compliance team. We certainly had with Ocean our fair share of those debates with our teams, whether it's legitimate interest for us to use the data points or it's actually for advertising purpose could be considered on the basis and the foundation of a user consent. But ultimately, that's something that needed to be understood, that when user data specifically is used for advertising purposes, it tends to get a little bit more touchy, especially in the eye of the regulators on that side. And lastly, of course, ad monetization, as mentioned before. So again, since we are not really able to optimize efficiently, since we are not really able to kind of have the best possible and most granular insights to kind of optimize towards the highest quality users that we can serve the ads to, that in turn, of course, means that there is a strong downward pressure on ACPMs. Henceforth, of course, games that are heavily ad monetized definitely have been seeing a difficulty. Of course, splitting out the different audiences, trying to build models based on still the opted-in users is perfectly doable, and that's something I believe most of the advertisers have been doing. Having said that, again, that's something where in the long term probably newer and more interesting solutions will be coming in. So in a nutshell, these would have been, I would say, the key practical implications that most of us has seen. Again, there are other, I would say, smaller nuanced things. Giving a concrete example, I have not yet reflected on that too much. But of course, especially for us, our game is a fairly large game, as we were just fortunate enough to introduce. And we also have, of course, quite a big project which is dealing always around the COPPA audience segments. So again, if a game is intended for a little bit younger demographics, that's also adding an additional layer of complexity, because then it's no longer just, okay, do we have the privacy consent, do we not have the privacy consent, but there's an additional dimension. Is the user in a certain age bracket that maybe we by law are required to anonymize or completely remove the information and the data points? And again, ultimately, that just adds to the complexity of the picture. Now for the good news. Of course, as in every challenge lies the opportunity for innovation. So there are definitely already known and proven ways how we can kind of tackle and get through these hurdles. I would like to go through now a couple of these potential recommendations. As mentioned, hopefully nothing groundbreaking new on that side. But again, ultimately, this is what hopefully will be building us the opportunity towards a more sustainable future. So again, we were discussing one more time kind of like the key points around user acquisition, creative optimization, audience management, and the ad monetization. So let's look at each and every one of them one more time, but now more with the eyes of what could we possibly do about it? What could be the potential solutions? So in the user acquisition space, so of course, again, rethinking campaign structures, making sure that the information that we have is the best possibly leveraged. So again, as opposed to, let's say, testing out 25 different channels and trying to hope and hit gold, maybe we would be refocusing on a couple of key channels, trying to invest the time and the effort to maximize it and use them to the best possible case. Additionally to that, of course, it is important that we always need to be kind of aware of the changing regulations and points. Giving a very, very concrete example from our case, Google, for instance, I'm not sure if many were aware of that. Between the United States and the European Union, there was not an international treaty which was called the Transatlantic Data Transfer Treaty, which literally went live, I believe, a little bit earlier this year. So according to the EU law, up until that point, technically using Google was considered to be a high-risk activity, simply because this international treaty was not in place. Again, coming from a space where we are very held on a tight leash from our compliance team, we were just actually able to restart once this treaty has been conducted, and this is essentially what provided us the basis in terms of the legitimate operations, how we can go about it to make sure that we are able to maximize this opportunity. For the creative optimization, I think we touched upon a lot. So of course, the Android platform is quite an easy and straightforward building block. Additionally, I would like to call a couple of safe bet iterations. So I believe we all have certain systems and tools where we're able to check our competition, check the market space. For instance, the Market IQ from the GameAnalytics team that is actually able to provide us some insights and intelligence on how the market overall performs. Based on these insights, we are able to make these safe bet iterations. So again, if something is a trend that is a market trend, chances are that there is a general appetite in the social media, in the mediums, that it would be kind of the users that will be responding to that. When it gets to audience management, again, leveraging the first-party data to the maximum possible extent and trying to kind of understand the way how we can use it in a legitimate and responsible way will be giving us quite an advantageous point. Giving a concrete example yet again at SYBO, since we are fortunate enough, of course, not just to have one very large game, but a number of smaller games around them, we are able to cycle our first-party data, for instance, for efficiently cross-promoting between the different titles. Now, I do know that maybe not all of the companies have the fortune to kind of have that level of a portfolio, but already if you are thinking about a second, a third, or even a fourth, fifth, whatever number of game, that incrementally will be helping you. The better you understand your own users, the better you can essentially legitimately segment out in-house without having to pass the information further. And then you would be able to migrate the portfolio. So that means that we are no longer talking about acquiring a user for a single game, but more for a portfolio of games or a brand or an IP. And in this case, you're actually able to recycle and use those user bases. Finally, to finish up with the ad monetization, so as mentioned and kind of hinted before, one of the things, of course, is just splitting out the consented, non-consented users. trying to understand certain experiments of how we can essentially design a little bit better. And on another general trend, something that definitely our teams, our administration teams have been focusing quite heavily on is trying to see how we would be able to tap into more generic brand commerce advertising that you usually consider to be a little bit more safe. Of course, there are still a couple of touchy topics and touchy sensitive products from the e-commerce side that we also would not like to showcase in our games. But generally, it tends to be considered a little bit more safer from a data privacy perspective, as opposed to, for instance, a very fine-grained optimized user acquisition campaign from a competitor from another application. So a little bit more kind of like a couple of concrete examples from our house. I have tried to provide a couple of practical examples throughout, but I a little bit wanted to provide a more structured way of kind of showcasing. So first, to kind of help you understand a little bit the SYBO context. So as mentioned, we operate at a scale which is 40 billion plus historic downloads on that side. We definitely have a very European mindset when it comes to kind of privacy. Of course, we are bound to be compliant with the GDPR, with different Danish regulations, still operating globally. So what this means, of course, that some of the activities and some of the things that we might be doing might not necessarily be required by law. For instance, thinking about, again, I think we were just talking about it with Federico, some of the emerging markets where maybe the privacy regulations are not yet as advanced as it is in Europe or in North America on that side. Still, what we try to do, we rather see it as a long-term game. In the short term, again, hands high, we definitely had some headaches and kind of bottlenecks in our operations because of this. But ultimately, in the long term, that's where it looks like it's an industry trend that things will be shifting. So we feel that by kind of doing and eating, so to say, these vegetables early enough, we will be in a better shape a little bit later, setting up for long-term success. And on these foundations, of course, our approach again is that first and foremost, compliance first. Granted the scale of Subway Surfers, our company and our game is quite under some public scrutiny. Of course, whenever there is kind of an example to be made, when it's a mobile game, chances are Subway Surfers are mentioned or referenced in some shape or form. I understand this might not be, again, the same exposure for others, so it might be a different risk profile. But for us, because of that, again, compliance became kind of a key priority for us. We are trying to, of course, balance out the risks and the opportunities. As our CEO likes to put it, we like to stay close to the fence, but not necessarily step very, very far away from it. So we definitely do not engage in, so to say, the gray zone activities, but we actively try to see, again, what is the boundaries that we can still, within a reasonable shape, can address. And again, stepping ahead from here, how we kind of try to operate this is, I would say, twofold in terms of the practices. So first and foremost, built-in privacy measures. So I will be showing you in a moment, for instance, some of our internal systems, kind of how the privacy is already built in. So for instance, whenever we are managing certain audiences, whenever we are creating certain campaigns like cross-promotion, how we are actually kind of thinking it from the very, very beginning. And then additional to that, of course, the vendor vetting process in our case is quite a heavy one. I believe Oshin, he's already smiling and laughing about it. He can tell that, again, getting a vendor through our privacy compliance questionnaire usually takes somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks, making sure that, years. There I stand corrected. I'm only with the company for 1.5 years, so excuse me on that. So long story short, again, there is quite a rigorous kind of step, again, coming yet again from the compliance first approach. And then in terms of like the practices, so of course we try to make sure that whenever we have regular checks and check marks, making sure that again the measurement systems are in line, in check. So of course one of the easiest and quickest way, granted that we are usually trying to operate a lot with data, is to kind of grab, is the counting the same? So for instance, if our internal in-house recording, does that match, for instance, what our MMP sees and vice versa, making sure that again all these technological pieces are there. And to provide again the concrete examples, so this is again an audience management, specifically for a cross-promotion system. I apologize, it might be a little too small, but essentially what you can see here that, for instance, we have the legal documentation right from the very beginning. So again, right at the point, every single time we need to declare the legal usage purpose, why we are using the segment, how we are intending to use that. And again, we have even more kind of like detailed guidelines. Also, behind this little form, pending on your selections, the following subsequent steps that you can see here will be limited pending on that. So again, by this systematic design, and again, putting compliance and privacy first, we are trying to make sure to kind of limit the, so to say, margin for human error to a minimum on that side. So let's look a little bit ahead, being in December, looking into 2025 and maybe a little bit beyond. So first and foremost, increased public scrutiny. I think this has been the trend, at least for the last 3-4 years at least, and this is something that we expect to continue, as definitely users and consumers as well as regulators are becoming more and more tech savvy. This trend is expected just to kind of continue and increase. Technological changes, I believe we all know that again, last year was the wow effect of kind of the generative AI and machine learning and everything related to this year we are seeing more and more utility, and of course we expect this trend to continue. In terms of the growth practices, so again, the more that we rely on some of these automated systems and tools, the more we need to understand how we essentially leverage the different data points among one another. And last but not least, as mentioned, we like to see every single challenge as an opportunity for innovation, even though maybe the tools and the technology is not yet available right here, right now. But that's something that we are expecting, again, more and more privacy-focused systems, tools, and technologies helping us. Of course, it's not going to be like one block after the other, but this is more an interlinked process. So essentially, every single time there is something new popping up, something new kind of like getting ahead. And of course, it is a global picture. So just like we mentioned, for instance, the UK Children's Code that was, I believe, established a couple of years back now is making its way, for instance, towards the EU and kind of like more the GDPR. Let it be the example of the e-privacy directive, which essentially is also intended to become an e-privacy regulation, not just kind of like a general guidelines. So there are a lot of kind of moving pieces. This on top of course, the technology, the ecosystem, let it be the new versions of Apple SKAd network, let it be the new Android privacy sandbox. So there are a lot of moving pieces around that. On that point, I would just really quickly, one more time, like to kind of summarize things. As mentioned, I don't believe I have shared like groundbreaking news, rather try to help a little bit structure kind of some of your thoughts and maybe some of the ideas and approaches, how you can deal with things. First and foremost, again, privacy needs to be in sight. As growth marketers, it is no longer kind of like an optional nice to have that we can just overlook. Second of all, I believe awareness is key. So we need to make sure that, again, we are aware and how we are treating this. We need to make sure essentially to step ahead and find ways to operate in this privacy conscious world. And of course, last but not least, trying to essentially use this to innovate, move towards the future with different systems, and hopefully the whole circle completes. And this is how we can future-proof ourselves for the foreseeable future. And in a nutshell, this would have been it. I thank you so much for listening and would be happy to answer any possible questions